Good evening. Welcome to you all. We're thankful to you for coming to the third annual Center for Practical Theology lecture. It's my pleasure to make a few introductions as part of our welcome. We have here tonight several faculty from Boston University's School of Theology and staff and deans. If you're a faculty or staff or a dean, a lowly dean at the School of Theology, please stand up and be recognized. We're glad you're here. She's standing. And if you're a colleague in the BTI, faculty member through one of the BTI schools, please stand and let us recognize you as well. We're glad you're here. If you're a student at Boston University School of Theology, stand up and be counted. That's fantastic. Pat McLeod, who's in the very back, our most recent PhD in practical theology, will you be taking count and making sure who's here? Turn that in. Congratulations to Pat, our most recent PhD in practical theology, all the way in the back there. We're really blessed to have some pastors and congregation members from local churches here. If you're from a local church or pastor, please stand and let us greet you. Thank you. All the way in the back there. Welcome. It's of course, my great pleasure to introduce Dean Mary Elizabeth Moore, who is going to say a bit about practical theology here at BU and introduce one of our newest faculty members, Dean Moore.
I invite Courtney Goto to come forward. I'm going to say just one word about practical theology here at BU, and that is thank you, thank you, thank you to Claire Wolfteich and Brian Stone. I also have the privilege to introduce our newest colleague, one of the directors, new director of the Center for Practical Theology, and a member of the faculty in practical theology, Courtney Goto. To introduce Courtney, I invite you to use your imagination so that you will get to know her. First, I invite you to imagine a candle shining brightly. And then I invite you to imagine fairies dancing on the pin of a needle. And then I invite you to imagine someone standing over a precipice about to fly off. And that's Courtney Goto. Courtney did her dissertation on artistic play and expecting the God of the unexpected. She teaches in religious education and practical theology. She is a magnificent teacher. She teaches courses like religious education and aesthetics, teaching and performance theory, and imagine some of the other options. She also is returning home here because she did her MTS at Harvard, and she is coming back to be a gift to Boston University School of Theology and the BTI, and we are so glad she's here. This was the closest I could come to fairies dancing on the pin of a needle and a candle.
We are really thrilled to welcome Courtney and also to welcome both Courtney and Dean Moore as our new co-directors of the Center for Practical Theology along with me and Brian. So welcome. We're really, really grateful to have all of your input and creative energy. So thank you. It's now my great privilege to introduce our speaker for tonight, Dr. Thomas Groom. We are thrilled that you can be here with us tonight. So glad for that. Tom Groom is professor of theology and religious education over at that other institution down the road, Boston College. He is chair of the Department of Religious Education and Pastoral Ministry in the BC School of Theology and Ministry. You might pick up the fact that he's from Ireland. He was born in County Kildare, and he holds the equivalent of a master's degree in divinity from St. Patrick's Seminary in Carlow, Ireland, as well as master's and doctoral degrees in religious education from Fordham University and Union Theological Seminary, Columbia. His primary area of interest, and the reason why we invited you to talk today, is in religious education. And he's going to talk today about the intersections between religious education and practical theology. His book, Educating for Life, A Spiritual Vision for Every Teacher and Parent, was published by Thomas More, and it's a book that reflects the way he teaches, and we'll pick some of this up tonight. Full of stories, full of examples, and good questions, inviting us to enter into the discussion with him and to engage with our own stories as well. He's also the author of Christian Religious Education, Sharing Our Story and Vision, and as well as Sharing Faith, a comprehensive approach to religious education and pastoral ministry, which received first place in the Catholic Press Association Awards the year that it was published. He has a new book coming out in the spring. It's called Will There Be Faith? And so we're looking forward to that, published by HarperCollins. He also has many books. He's really a leader in the field of Catholic studies and books about Catholic identity. What does it mean to be Catholic? Which, as many of you know, is just a critical question for many of us here in the Boston area over the last number of years. So we're very grateful for Tom for leading the way and helping to define what it really means to be Catholic. A couple of those books, a new book called Reclaiming Catholicism, Treasures Old and New, that he wrote with several colleagues, as well as the book What Makes Us Catholic? 8 Gifts for Life. Okay, we really welcome you, Tom. We're so grateful for your leadership in these various areas of practical theology, religious education, and Catholicism, and helping to shed a light in that direction. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you, everybody, for coming and joining us this evening. And I think this is the right occasion, and all of you are speakers and preachers and teachers yourselves and have found yourself in a situation where you're definitely in the right place at the right time, but you may not have prepared the right sermon or the right presentation. Has anybody had that experience? Because I've been sitting here saying to myself, I wonder, will my topic tonight be of any great interest to anybody other than the doctoral students who are here in practical theology and in religious education? And in many ways, I prepared the conversation this evening with them very much in mind, because at the association meeting of practical theology here at BU back in the springtime, it was one of the lively topics, because as religious education and practical theology, in many ways, at least in North America, continues to look for its place, especially within academia. And then, of course, you run into limited resources and limited slots and all the rest of it. I suppose my apprehension was that we might start competing with each other, vying with each other for the support of our institutions. And I suppose I see the task as an essential partnership between practical theology and religious education. So that's our topic for the evening. It's the only one I've prepared. And so whether you like it or not is pretty much what we're probably going to do. But I will bring you very much into the conversation. And so you can have a good chat with your neighbor, at least, if what I'm saying isn't of any particular great relevance or interest to your work. So I want to begin, though, by recognizing this wonderful Center for Practical Theology that has emerged here at Boston University. I congratulate you for it, your wonderful faculty, and now adding Courtney to your faculty. It's just a great joy to see practical theology beginning to emerge in the theologates of North America. For many years, it's been a very established discipline or theological discipline within the European universities, and indeed in many of the theologates and seminaries of the Orient, of Asia as well, and throughout Africa and Australia. But for some reason, practical theology, pastoral theology has been a kind of a poor relation, as it were, here in the North American context. So it's marvelous to see BU doing what they're doing, doing what you're doing in this center. I want to thank Claire for inviting me. And I learned years ago that it's sometimes important to identify who invited you. I was invited, this is about 20, 30 years ago, shortly after I finished my own doctoral work at Columbia and at Union Theological. I was invited to do a clergy day with a group of priests in a diocese that will remain nameless, but a very conservative and a very traditional diocese and a very conservative group of priests. And this was still in the afterglow of the Second Vatican Council, and I was holding forth about this extraordinary council that the Holy Spirit had launched on the church and world, and the great reforms and renewals that were going to emerge from it, and all kinds of new topics were on the table, like the ordination of women, the ordination of married men, the election of bishops, and lay participation in the leadership and governance of the church. Marvelous ideas. And these people, I was basically trying to convince them that the Holy Spirit was going to do a better job than the Holy Ghost used to do in the church, and that this was a very important switch. And they were ready probably to say the rosary facing the people, but to say Mass facing the people, they weren't quite there yet. So as the first session unfolded, I could hear the mumbling and the grumbling and people talking to each other out of the side of their mouth. And I knew by the end of the first hour that I had lost them. And they got up to shuffle out to the break time. And there was one older priest who had smiled a couple of times and kind of nodded his head a few times. But he was the only participant I had in the whole group that was anyway on my side. And sure enough, at the break time, he kind of held back. And, so I went over and I said, "Father," I said, "this is pretty bad, isn't it?" He said, "Yeah, this is pretty bad, Tom." But then I said, "Well, Father, it's not that bad, is it?" He said, "Tom, I don't blame you at all. I blame the people who invited you." So Claire is the one who invited me. So if this doesn't work, at least you know who to blame. I'm going to begin by telling somewhat of an autobiographical story of how, in a sense, I stumbled into my own vocation in life of religious education. And the point I want to make is that this topic is not simply a theoretical question or a noetic question for me. It's also an existential one and a vocational one, and has been throughout my life. The correlation, the integration between theology and education, or what I'll focus more precisely on this evening as the correlation between practical theology and religious education, which simplifies the question a little, but not a lot. And how do you carry water on both shoulders, as it were, for education and for theology? And then, as I said, the more contemporary question, especially as these two disciplines emerge as scholarly disciplines within academia, is it possible to be both and? And how do you go about doing that? So I stumbled into it because in my fourth year of theology in my Irish seminary, and Claire gave the game away by telling you where I was from. You never would have known otherwise, probably. But in my fourth year of theology, it was our deacon year, and we had to do a pastoral experience. We'd call it contextual education or something now. And I arrived back late because I had some sickness at the end of the summer, and I came back to the seminary, St. Patrick's in Carlow, Ireland. I came back late, and sure enough, all the hot and jazzy pastoral situations and contexts had been taken already. All the field placements were gone. And so my colleagues who had been back before me, sure enough, they were going to work in the prisons, they were going to work with the gypsies, they were going to work with street people and visit all kinds of things and go on immersion trips to God knows where. But the only thing left when I came back, the only thing, pastoral situation where I could fulfill my requirement, was to teach high school sophomore religion in the local high school. And I moaned and groaned about it, and my friends sympathized and empathized, and what a dreadful thing, and you'll definitely, it's the toughest assignment of the lot, and these kids aren't interested anyway. But there was a part of me that was secretly excited about it. And I wondered what that was about, was this a peculiarity or something? So I sallied forth the first morning, with my lecture prepared, because that's the pedagogy I knew best, and it was a rough morning. And the second morning was no better. And the third morning, it was even worse. And by about the end of the second week, I knew I was failing miserably to reach these young people. But in a moment of grace, I decided to put the question to them. And I kind of said, what am I doing wrong here? How would I ever get you interested? Is there any hope for us this year? Because I am going to be showing up here three mornings a week for the rest of the year, and I'm miserable, you look miserable, so what are we going to do about this? Well, they said, Tom, yeah, sure, we can tell you, no problem at all. So I said, well, what would you like to talk about? Now, later I met Paulo Freire and was blessed to work personally with Freire and to co-teach with Freire a number of times at Boston College, and I found a language for what these young people wanted me to do. They wanted me to establish some generative themes. In other words, things of real substance, things of real interest to their lives, and to begin there. So we made up a list of topics, and I was happy to begin with their interests. I also knew that their interests need to be educated. I have a friend who teaches junior high music, and she always begins by asking her students what are they interested in, and of course they're interested in whatever, rap and rock and hard rock and acid and all the rest of it. And she begins there. But then by Halloween, she has them listening to and enjoying Beethoven. So you begin with people's interests, but you also educate their interests. So I was willing to begin with their interests, but then after a while you say to sophomore boys, yeah, but talking about girls and sex all year will get boring. So there has to be something else we do here by way of, but so we came up with a lot of generative themes, like what is life all about, and what am I going to do with it, and who is my neighbor, and what's it all about anyhow, and how should we approach it, and deep existential questions. But then I began to recognize that indeed there are great responses from Christian faith, great spiritual wisdom out of Christian faith that can respond to these questions. So then, as we talked through the questions and began with their thematics, there were ways that I could indeed introduce and readily access the wisdom of Christian faith into their lives as well. And then with the hope that they would come back to their own lives with that wisdom and put it to work. So in a sense, my original approach began in that classroom about 40 years ago in an Irish high school. I've published large books about it since then. But there's a very simple idea in the whole approach. It's simply bringing life to faith and bringing faith to life. Now, don't tell anybody it's that simple, because they might not buy the books and so on anymore. But it really comes down to taking our lives and bringing it to our faith, and taking our faith and bringing it to our lives. Now, afterwards, of course, I found all kinds of other people who had said similar things, and Paul Tillich's correlative and correlation method, and David Tracy, and all kinds of scholars. And of course, Freire continued to have a lasting impact. So that in a sense, I began to get excited. And by the end of that year, in many ways, I had found my vocation. Later I went on to Union Seminary and Columbia, and there they did begin to teach us how to carry water on both shoulders. Now, I was very fortunate at Union to work with people like Bev Harrison, who was my primary advisor, and a great radical feminist ethicist, and very much committed to the emancipatory power, the liberating power of Christian faith. And so it was very much of a practical theology. I also did significant work at Woodstock, the Jesuit theologate that was next door to Union at the time, and Avery Dulles was a profound influence on me. And again, the responsibility of the church to be a sacrament of God's reign in the world, to be an effective sign, an effective community of God's grace, doing God's will on earth as it is done in heaven, as it were, rather than simply praying, thy kingdom come. So that influence of practical theology there was tremendously important, but so too at Columbia. I was blessed to work with Dwayne Huebner. I had to encounter Freire and so on. People deeply committed to the humanizing, to the conscientizing responsibilities of education. And that helped to begin, but I still had water on both shoulders, as it were, and how was I going to carry both? I came on to Boston College. I don't want to go too far afield. This is all an introduction, by the way. I didn't get to my talk at all yet. But I know you're not going to like the talk, so therefore I'm kind of dwelling on the long introduction. Or the talk might not be equally relevant to everybody. When I came on to Boston College, I found myself appointed as the professor of theology and religious education. But I saw my primary identity as religious education. I'd become convinced that there's nothing that the church does in the world that is more important, that is more significant, that is more to the mission of the church than how it educates. How it educates, why it educates, what it educates in faith, I think is a make or break issue for the life of the church in the world. And I saw also the opportunity and the need to give it a scholarly foundation within an academic context, so that it would be treated as and would be indeed considered a serious academic discipline. And my own feeble efforts to that end, I always hope my doctoral students will go far beyond me, obviously, and I'm sure they will, but my own feeble efforts efforts to that end have been very much geared toward helping to establish it as a bona fide discipline, scholarly discipline, the foundations of how and why the church goes about educating in the world as it does and as it should. So that was helpful, but I also was wondering then, how do I hold these two together? I joined all kinds of learned societies, the Catholic Theological Society of America, the American Academy of Religion, but my primary home was within a group we call APRI, the Association of Professors in Religious Education. And I saw myself primarily as a religious educator who happened to be doing theology until Don Browning, and I was talking to my friend Mary Elizabeth about this. Don Browning called me one day and he said, Tom, we're founding a new organization, the International Academy of Practical Theologians. It's going to be a group of scholars from throughout the world. And Don Browning, I always consider as kind of the father of practical theology here in North America. And Lord rest him, he just went home to God this past year, a dear friend to many of us. And he called me up and he said, Tom, we've really decided that you are a practical theologian. And I said, Don, no, I'm a religious educator. He said, no, you're a practical theologian. If you're along with us, you're definitely a practical theologian. You're in our company. We want you to be, you are. And I said, well, why would you say that? He said, well, your whole methodology of moving from praxis to theory to praxis is precisely what we're doing as practical theologians. Well, Don was a very important person to me. He'd written a review of my first book, a very critical review. Or at least it turned out by the end to be quite a critical review, I thought. But the opening sentence was, this is the most important book since Horace Bushnell published Christian Nurture. Horace Bushnell published Christian Nurture in 1860. And I really didn't read any further. I just said, this is what I'm looking, because I was up for tenure at the time at Boston College, and if Don Browning, a university professor of the University of Chicago, said this about a junior scholar's book, I said, I don't care what he thinks about it after that. I mean, he can, whatever opinion he has is fine. I think he got it wrong, actually, but anyway. But we became wonderful friends. But he said, no, please come join us. And I remember my first meeting of the International Academy of Practical Theology, and I've been to many of them since then. It was almost like a homecoming, because I did find the community of theological discourse that was nearest and dearest to my heart. So in a sense, it has been a tension throughout my own life, how to be both educator and theologian, to be both religious educator and practical theologian. So, and I can empathize with young people, with young scholars especially emerging into the field, having the same question. And it did occur to me at our conference here at BU in the springtime that it would be very unfortunate, it seems to me. I do have a little clicker someplace. Oh, here it is over here. It would be very unfortunate if we were to begin to compete or to be anything other than partners, and it is an essential partnership. So that's a long-winded way of saying why the topic, that it is an existential question for myself. I am talking very much into the North American context, because how I'm going to describe religious education and practical theology is fairly particular to us, and it is at different places, as I said earlier, throughout the world. But they're both still emerging as academic disciplines, at least as I would see it. And my dear friend and colleague, Dean Moore, I think we would have very similar perspectives on it. Both have very similar intent, practical theology and religious education. Our concern, our hope, our intention is to promote a faith that is lived, that is done, that is realized in the world, that is living, that is vibrant, and that is life-giving for oneself and for the life of the world. And yet, as I said, we might begin to vie for status. That would be unfortunate. Just by way of definition, what is religious education? I'm often asked that. I used to say that I knew, and now I typically say I'm at a bit of a loss, really. But I am convinced that if you have good theology and you have good education, you'll probably have good religious education. All in favor? Say aye. It's kind of a no-brainer in a sense. It is at the interface of theology, but it has to be good theology. It has to be good education. And I think we need both. To teach good theology poorly will be ineffective. To teach poor theology well will be dangerous. Likewise, then practical theology, just as a kind of a working definition or description so that the conversation can unfold. Practical theology I understand as theology done from and for the practice and the practices of faith. It's done from the practice of faith and for the practice of faith, with deep ecclesial commitments, but with great social concerns and responsibilities as well. Neither one sees themselves now, and we both enterprises push back against a lot of stereotypes. Neither one of us see ourselves as a delivery system, as simply applying theory to practice. And I suppose here we'd be very much on the same page. And instead, if my little thing will work here, both are deeply committed to a methodology that begins with the praxis of life, what Freire might call people's own realidad, with the generative themes of life, with what matters most to us, what is of import to our lives, and especially to our being in the world, and then brings that to the theoretical resources, which of course in our field is theology and scripture, but then always with the intention of renewed faith, of returning to faith again. Bringing life to faith and faith to life, at least to learn from, not just simply to learn about, or to be clear about, or to understand, but to really truly learn from faith traditions. It is both enterprises, practical theology and religious education, I think share a similar epistemology, where we think about life as a source of knowing, a source, not just a recipient of knowing, but also a source of knowing, a source of spiritual wisdom, and especially of spiritual wisdom for life. Both of them share a common hermeneutics, that we think we begin with practical intent, that the practical intent is not there just simply at the end as a question of application, but rather indeed begins, we have that perspective, as it were, as we approach texts, as we approach life, to interpret them toward renewed faith and the practice of faith. Not something that comes, as I said, as kind of an application of the theory, but an interest in practice from the beginning. We have the same primary partners, conversation partners, scripture studies, and other theological disciplines. Both religious education and practical theology turn very readily and increasingly to the social sciences, because if you're going to begin with people's lives and take them seriously as a locus of God's self-disclosure in their lives, if you're looking at that potential with the hope that indeed this faith will come back as a living and vibrant faith, then knowing that the situation, whether it's psychological or cultural or social or anthropological or political, knowing one's realidad and drawing upon the sciences that study that in a in-depth way, in a scholarly way, obviously is a source of wisdom. It's a source of our theologizing, which often confuses people who read texts in the tradition of practical theology. I always remember my good friend and indeed mentor, Avery Dulles. He wrote a review of Miguel Benigno's book. I forget the name of Benigno's first book, but Dulles wrote a review of it, and Benigno was a wonderful Argentinian theologian, and Dulles said, well, the first 75 pages are just it shouldn't even be in the book. They're not theology. Well, Benigno was reflecting on the gross national product and the annual income and all the rest of the rates of poverty in Argentina, but it was a different way of doing theology. But to Avery, trained in a more traditional systematic theology, I don't in any way disparage that, he was a dear friend and mentor to me in many ways, it was just very strange to start off with the GNP of Argentina in a theology book. You know, you started with the Trinity or, the decrees of Chalcedon or something, but, the GNP of Argentina shouldn't be on the agenda for theologians. Well, it has to be if you're going about doing theology this way. There's also something in the pedagogy, and I'm going to come back at the end. There will be an end, by the way. I'm going to come back at the end to say why the pedagogy may be the key common ground on which we can stand together as both as practical theologians and as religious educators. But both religious ed and practical theology neither one is well served by what John Dewey called abundant lecturing, or what Whitehead called inert ideas, or what Freire called banking education. So that's going to be my primary point of the evening, that if we're going to do theology and train people to do theology and to think theologically in context and in situations, then that won't be achieved, it seems to me, by abundant lecturing, which of course I will have to stop doing very soon, or I will not be honoring my own principles. Both are concerned, in other words, with the situation, the communication, and the appropriation of faith to life. Both very, very practical concerns. Both must reach beyond, and this is Bernard Lonergan, that it's not enough to bring people to the understanding of faith. Anselm's wonderful definition, notwithstanding, that theology is faith seeking understanding. And indeed it is. Theology is faith seeking understanding. But a practical theologian or a religious educator says, and then what? After you've come to understand it, Lonergan would say that you're only halfway to authentic cognition, because the dynamics of authentic cognition not only look at data and come to understand it, but in fact come to judgments and decisions as well. And I suppose both practical theology and religious education take very seriously that whole dynamic of cognition and leading people to judgments and decisions as well. This is to bring you back into the conversation. I meant to get to this sooner, but we'll do this a couple of times. What I want you to do, well, first of all, do you agree or disagree, nuance or add to what I've been saying so far? And there may be lots of things that you might agree, disagree, or add to what I'm saying. But I suppose, insofar as you can recognize the issue, and if it isn't, as I said, a very lively or pressing issue for you, I'll understand. But when you think about the relationship between if you want to take it generically, education and theology, how do you understand that relationship? Or more particularly, religious education and practical theology? How would you sense that relationship? How should they be good partners, or are they different enterprises and about very different things? Would you turn to a neighbor at your table, say hello to the neighbor if you haven't said hello already? If you're tired talking to the old neighbor beside you, then just shout across the table to the other one or turn the other direction. Turn to some person and have a chat for the next 3 minutes. And is it making any sense at all? Or do you just, if you had a couple of glasses of wine, you're probably enjoying it. But if you didn't, and the bar unfortunately is closed, but let's go to work for 3 or 4 minutes with a neighbor, see what they're thinking and talking about, especially by way of the bond, the relationship between these two great human enterprises that are so vital to the life of the world. Let's go. And I'll call us back together in about 3 or 4 minutes. And I will join a neighbor as well. You'll be back with your neighbor again in about 20 minutes. But I'd love to hear some of the comments, and my new colleague, Courtney, and I won't tell the story of how we first met, but I'm delighted to see Courtney, the new faculty person here in religious education. Courtney will take the microphone and probably help me respond as well. Comments? Somebody want to share a thought?
That they asked us to not speak until the microphone gets there.
Okay.
Don't do what I just did.
Okay. All right. Be like I say, rather than yourself. Thank you. A thought? Comment?
You said practical theology is done from and for the practice of faith.
Yes.
When you say from the practice of faith, does that mean that the theologian, the practical theologian, is also a person that has to identify as a person of faith?
Well, but then how many of us would be fully qualified, you know? I think so. I think it has to begin with, now, could somebody be empirical, purely empirical, and looking at religious practices and studying them? And then, but I do think if you're to come to theologize, I mean, Anselm's old definition presumes faith, that it's faith-seeking understanding. Now, in the cultural context of the time, atheism wasn't an option. In the 11th century. So everybody were assumed to be people of faith. Can we do the same today? But I would tend to say yes. What would you say?
I was going to use the excuse of
Well,
not
you asked the
having
question. So, pardon?
It definitely is an ongoing question, especially as a practical theologian who might use the social sciences, because then why not have it be a social scientist who can start in that same, start from practice.
I'm going to come back to that because there is a whole strain. I was talking to my friend Mary Elizabeth. If I don't always refer to her as Dean Moore, it's because we go back about 35 years of friendship. That when you take somebody like Hans van der Ven and some of the Dutch school or the empirical theologians of Europe, that it can at times look like a religious studies, an empirical study of religious practices. But I'm hesitant to yet call that theology. I think And do they reach the point of theologizing out of the data they collect? I don't see it happening as much. And do they engage the deep generative themes of people's lives and propose Christian wisdom in a way that might give life to the person and to the world? I don't see them doing that either. So I'm pretty traditional in my sense of practical theology. I do think it should arise from communities of faith or from the life of the world, but return to enhance communities of faith as well. But I wouldn't want to be, I always say, which one of us is entitled to exclude anybody from a community of Christian faith? I mean, hands up anybody who truly lives the great commandment, the love of enemies, doing good to those who hate you and going the extra mile. So who's qualified to say, you're not worthy to be one of us? So I always think, even with theologians, it's better to bring them along than to drive them away. Yeah. So even if they're not vibrant members of the faith community yet, I'll pray for them and talk to them and educate them maybe, and hope always. Yes. Thank you. Another thought, comment, and feel free to come back against what I'm saying and disagree very readily if the Spirit moves you. Just test the Spirit, whichever Spirit it might be. Another thought? Here. Thank you, Courtney. Please.
A thought that I had in my discussion that, especially at the seminary level, the seminary education is religious education, but in many ways, in the different forms of religious education, between the parish, between the school, between the seminary, you're really getting at Fowler's faith development. In Fowler's both a religious educator and a practical theologian. How do you really distinguish amongst the two? They're a very similar field.
There should be. They're certainly terribly simpatico. I suppose when we begin to lay the scholarly foundations of them, there is room for research and scholarly writing and academic foundations and so on for both enterprises. And I suppose the religious educator does tend to turn more toward the literature of education. So Paulo Freire and Dewey and Maria Montessori and the great philosophers of education become important conversation partners, it seems to me, for the religious educator, in ways that might not be true for the practical theologian, for example, who's in homiletics or who is in pastoral care and counseling. So I think we might have different conversation partners, and yet I think we will gather at the well and around a common purpose or a common sense of purpose in the life of the church and for the life of the world. Yeah, thank you. One more comment, and then I'll make a few more suggestions myself. There's a hand over there. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, for this fantastic presentation and these great questions. And I'd like to ask, how do you see spirituality fitting into this?
Well, and while you should ask as well, Professor of Spirituality at Andover Newton. Here is the foundation of it all, really, and it's certainly the intention of it all. When you stop and think about it, our ultimate learning outcome, if you were to put this to the question, to the biblical word, what is the intention? It's very clear throughout the biblical text that we are to educate. From Deuteronomy 26, and Yahweh God saying through Moses, be earnestly on your guard, never forget what your eyes have seen, never let it slip from your memory as long as you live, but teach it to your children, to your children's children. And so the whole handing on of the faith is an imperative aspect of Hebrew identity and of Hebrew faith, of Israelite faith. Likewise, you come into the New Testament, and of course this is a biased reading, but over 150 times his work is described as teaching. Then at the end, of course, the last great mandate is to everybody, and it is to everybody on that mountainside in Galilee, go teach. Go evangelize. So he didn't say, now I want you three to be liturgists and you three to be canon lawyers, and maybe Mary and Salome and Magdala, maybe you'd be bishops perhaps. Or he didn't, unfortunately, he didn't do that. It would have helped maybe if he had, but the mandate was given to all the baptized, to the small community there present. So in other words, it comes with our baptism, the responsibility to educate. But why? To what end? And in a sense, it's not so that people will know about their faith. Eventually, the ultimate learning outcome, it seems to me, is spiritual wisdom. That we come indeed to understand our faith and appropriate it to our lives. But it has to become a spiritual wisdom for life by which we live. And so in a sense, the ultimate outcome is spirituality. that we lived into holy lives. I mean, to what other end is it intended? I'm always saddened when I hear of people leaving the Christian community or leaving Christian church because they wanted to take care of their spirituality. But it's a sad reflection on the church if people do that, because it should be our best. It's our stock in trade, ultimately, is spirituality. So the grounding of it, but then that will suggest a pedagogy, that if you're going to educate people's souls, then you better get down deep into their souls. You better engage their very being. And not simply teach them about great ideas. You'll do that, but there has to be a way of engaging their lives and connecting it with their lives. And if it doesn't connect, then I don't think the spirituality is as likely to happen. How would you answer your own question?
I think you're right on. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Let me push on and make a few suggestions, and then I will give it back to you again and see what wisdom is emerging among us. Now, some of you never heard of these people, so I'll do this quickly. Some of you grew up with them and remember them well, but there have been some false starts to what the partnership might be. I remember a colleague, James Michael Lee, again recently gone home to God, who was a very eminent author of many texts on religious education. He also was the publisher of the Religious Education Press. And James Michael Lee was adamant that religious education should avoid theology at all costs. That it was the social sciences where they were going to be our friends. Theologians typically know nothing about teaching, and the theology they come up with isn't very helpful either. So stay clear of theology. Now, I'm caricaturing only a little, wouldn't you say, Mary Ellen? He was just vitriolic about people who turned to theology because, well, he had a valid point, or at least he was pushing back against a stereotype, namely that, and his great phrase was, religious educators are not the messenger boys, and he might say girls now, that are not the messenger people of theologians. So it's not as if the theologians and the scripture scholars come up with it and then the religious educators go and deliver it. So he was pushing back against that stereotype, but I think took it to a horrible extreme. And if you ever want to see a critique of my own work, then read the footnotes in James Michael Lee's book, and you will definitely find a strident critique there, mostly because I was so disposed toward theology. But going back to my friends in that high school, that Irish high school, what I learned from them was I needed good theology to touch their lives, especially if I was to bring them to spiritual wisdom. But I also needed good education. I had good theology prepared in those lectures I had ready for them the first month. But I didn't have good education. So they were the ones who forced me to realize that both were necessary. But Jim Lee missed that. I would say Hans van der Ven, a very eminent European Dutch theologian, practical theologian, one of the founding members as well of that original group, and Mary Elizabeth was one of the founding members, as well as myself, and many other people that names you'd recognize in practical theology, Rick Osmer and so on. But van der Ven has a very empirical approach to doing it all, and I don't know that it ever gets to practical theology, at least as I would understand practical theology, even going back to the good question raised here, or that it ever intends to reach to religious education. And I think both religious ed and practical theology need to be done from and for lived faith, and need to engage the generative themes of people's lives, that it can't simply be, now there's a room, of course, for empirical theology, but to stop with that or to limit oneself to that, I think would be quite narrow, a very narrow tunnel. Also, a historical note, it all could have been all put together very happily and effectively by Schleiermacher if we really had followed his advice. And you remember that Schleiermacher distinguished theology into three aspects: the historical, which of course reviews the roots of Christianity; philosophical theology, which he saw as laying out the essence of Christianity; and then practical theology, which he saw as studying the practice and the practices of Christianity, and which he referred to as the crown of theology. Now, many Protestant seminaries, and theologians especially, did indeed follow Schleiermacher's divisions, and the Europeans, I think, did it more consistently than we did here in North America. Schleiermacher was convinced that the purpose, that each of these three, both historical, philosophical, and practical theology, that each one presupposes the other two. And I totally agree with his proposal. They do, and that they all should correlate and enrich each other and should interact dialectically. And I think he was using that word pretty much as it was being used in the European philosophical conversation of the time, that there was a genuine give and take, not as Marx misinterpreted Hegel as thesis, antithesis, synthesis, but as a kind of a what do you agree with, disagree with, how do we contribute to each other, how do we correct each other, how can practical theology be a source of systematic theology? Rather than simply a receiver from systematic theology. How do you do systematic theology? And of course, many of the liberation theologians have indeed gone about it that way. So this praxis to theory to praxis is not unique to practical theology. My friend Gustavo Gutierrez and indeed Bev Harrison and the other great liberation theologians I've met along the way would all claim to be doing theology that way. But Schleiermacher said the whole thing should all exist in one big happy family. Why didn't it happen? Because it didn't really. I think that the Enlightenment episteme was the problem, because when Kant, and some of the good philosophers here better than I will surely disagree with this, but I think when Kant divided theoretical or pure reason from practical reason, and the whole philosophical world seemed to buy into that, including the theological world, I think it was a dreadful disservice. Now, there are ways in which I love Kant. I've tried to read him seriously. I've used his work in my own work. But that division, that separation, now I'm sure if he was here, he said, never intended, there were different aspects of the knowing process. But the division between theoretical or pure reason, as he often called it, and practical reason, and never the twain shall meet, really, was a real problem. It was a problematic, at least. And I think the European academic world took it to even beyond where Kant ever intended. I would propose. And you take up somebody almost about 100 years later writing about the year, I would think of Kant about 1800 and then Husserl about 1900. But I think it reaches a kind of an epitome in Husserl, who begins to talk about the theologian or the scholar as bracketing, literally bracketing out any kind of historical interest, any kind of practical interest. That to do practical stuff is obviously beneath the level of any kind of academic rigor. That you couldn't be serious if you were doing practical stuff, if you didn't bracket out your interests, if you didn't bracket out your context, your social location, and so on. Now, there was a power to that type of rigorous academic, well, it eventually becomes a technical rationality, really, as if it's devoid of historical circumstance and context, or what Sandra Harding says, kind of presuming a view from nowhere. And there's no such thing as a view from nowhere. We all come from somewhere, which is one of the reasons I told some of my own biographical story to begin. It's always laden. It's always never value-free or interest-free. It's always perspectival. And so to kind of, there's a great myth to that kind of Enlightenment paradigm that so often ends up disparaging people who have an interest in the practical, as if you couldn't be serious. You're not really a true scholar if you have those practical interests, and if you foreground them as indeed constitutive of your way of doing theology. So in a sense, I think Schleiermacher's proposal floundered on Kantian epistemology, or on what became the dominant episteme, especially of the European Enlightenment. Let me see if I can go forward here. Here we go. Religious education, just a brief note, it emerged as began to emerge as a serious academic discipline as education emerged. And so the great architects of modern education, Comenius, Pestalozzi, Herbart, and so on, and Maria Montessori wrote her dissertation on Comenius. Dewey, of course, was profoundly influenced by Herbart. A lot of it merged in the Catholic tradition into what we came to call the Munich method, the Munich approach to religious education. And then it came in through Dewey and George Albert Coe into Protestant Sunday school and religious education, and especially in the founding of the REA in 1903. And I'm going to pick up on that as perhaps a clue to how we belong together as theologians, educators, practical theologians, religious educators. The purpose of the REA, as Dewey and Coe and those people crafted it in 1903, and it was a great movement. It started at the University of Chicago, and there was like tens of thousands of people at their original conventions and so on, the Religious Ed Association. It has since dwindled to a faithful remnant, and maybe we're not even faithful anymore. But the purpose of the REA was to bring education to religion and religion to education. And I think if you take out the word religion and put in the word theology, I think you'll begin to get a hint at how the partnership might unfold, to bring education to theology and to bring theology to education. I think each needs the other, especially if we are to do religious education and practical theology toward a lived faith. I think if we intend to nurture and form people's being, and I mean that both as noun and verb, both who they are and how they live their lives, if we're to get into people's souls, if we are to bring them to spiritual wisdom, if we're to bring them to the convictions of Christian faith and the approximation of discipleship to Jesus Christ, I don't know how we'll do that simply with theology alone, as we've typically understood it, or simply with education alone. I think they desperately need each other to be effective in that regard. So I do think it's a clue to the partnership between religious ed to PT and PT to religious ed, distinguished only by emphasis, but not by enterprise, or certainly not separated, I suppose. So a distinction may be in order, but certainly not a separation. I think religious education needs practical theology to educate in faith for the life of the world. John 6:51. If we are to educate in faith for the life of the world, then I do think the kind of theology that we draw upon, that we render access to, that we engage, has to have a very practical intent. I think it has to be a theology that is indeed capable of informing people in faith, but is also likely to form them and even to transform them. In other words, lifelong conversion toward God's reign for their own lives and for the life of the world. I think to educate for the spiritual wisdom of Christian faith, for a realized faith, I think religious educators need practical theology, need good theology, need theology that indeed is livable and can be put to work. That may sound like a works righteousness kind of Catholic heresy, but I don't think it is. I always say there's two bad heresies to avoid in all of this. One is the Protestant heresy of cheap grace, as Bonhoeffer called it, and then the other is the Catholic heresy of good works, or the works righteousness. But the line is in between those two erroneous positions. I think practical theology needs religious education. Now, this is where I'm on thin ice, and some of you practical theologians may disagree with me, and you're very welcome to. But I think you need religious education for how and why you teach. And I do think that the pedagogy is and should be constitutive of how we do practical theology. And I'll put you back to talk with your neighbor in a moment, but I'm always chagrined when I go to the International Academy of Practical Theology, and I find that we're simply conducting business like you would at any learned conference. In other words, scholars get up and read papers at each other, to each other perhaps, and then there's a question and answer. And I say to myself, but this does not represent practical theology. That our methodology of moving from praxis to theory to praxis should somehow be represented in our pedagogy. Because I think the pedagogy is constituent. What do practical theologians do? Most of us teach. Well, that teaching is constitutive of how you do theology and how you prepare people to do theology. So I think learning from religious educators, the little we know about it, of how to mount a pedagogy that does indeed reflect the methodology, to honor the methodology of praxis to theory to praxis in the very act of teaching. In other words, I was talking to Courtney, my new colleague here, that to do good practical theology, I think you need good religious education. A biased opinion, of course, but precisely because of the methodology espoused by practical theology. That to do otherwise is, in a sense, I always remember Johann Baptist Metz, a wonderful theologian, a dear man, teaching a course at Boston College many years ago. I was a junior faculty at the time, and I took the course. And it was based on chapter 9 of his wonderful book, Faith in History and Society. I believe it was chapter 9. The title of chapter 9 was The Shift from a Theoretical, it's something like The Shift from a Theoretical, Abstract or something, theology to a narrative, practical theology. Or I forget the exact title, but the course was named after that one chapter in Faith and History and Society. But he was trying to mount the shift from a purely theoretical to a more practical narrative theology. But he came in, and through no fault of his own, I'm not in any way, because he probably didn't have the background in this regard, but he came in and basically taught the course as if it was an exercise in the theoretical foundations of theology, which should be moved to a narrative practical approach. But he simply lectured for an hour and 45 minutes and then asked were there any questions. And I remember thinking, but this is not the pedagogy that would well serve the theological intent that he was espousing, and very with great conviction and with great insight, and I'd never say otherwise. But the pedagogy itself in many ways was defeating the very purpose and intention that he had in teaching it. And I think also to mediate between life and faith toward a lived faith, I do think that's part of the intent of practical pastoral theology, mediating between life and faith toward a lived faith. I always think of that stranger on the road to Emmaus as the best example we have of this in this regard. Remember him coming there's two of them stumbling out of Jerusalem on that Easter Sunday morning, and lost people, given up hope. We were hoping he was the one. And he meets them along the way, and what does he say to them? Well, he joins their company and walks with them, and says to them, what are you discussing? Tell me about your life. What's going on? And they say, are you the only one in Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that went on there these past few days? And he says, watch this, what things? Oh. Now let's agree, nobody knew better than he what went on in Jerusalem these past few days. I mean, he could have told them things they'd never dreamt of, what he said to Herod, what Pilate said to him, but he wants them to name their own realidad, to name their own life. And that's precisely what they do. They tell him their story, their vision, their shattered vision. He was the one we were hoping would set Israel free. Besides all this, some women of our group went to the tomb and come back with this amazing story that he is risen, that he's alive, and we're getting out of there, basically. And only then does he enter in the faith of the community. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interprets for them every passage that refers to himself, and did not the Messiah have to so suffer so as to enter into his glory, entering in a dialectic between their hope, the one who would set Israel free, with a suffering Messiah, and leaving them to struggle with that. And still the amazing thing about that text is he begins with their life, he brings them to the faith tradition, and yet he waits and waits, and how difficult it can be to wait for them to come to see for themselves. He never tells them what to see. And eventually in the breaking of the bread at the table, they come to see for themselves. And of course then they're full of beans and want to go back to Jerusalem and tell everybody about it. They go back to their own lives with renewed faith. And he of course disappears. What else would he do, really? The pedagogy was done. The class was over. But of course the great question is, where did he go? And the only response, I think, or the best response, Richard Dillon, who wrote his dissertation on this text, says the best response Christians can give, he disappeared into them, into us, into the body of Christ. So why we go about it, it's always somehow to meet people. May you be meeting them in trauma, because those disciples coming out of Jerusalem were indeed traumatized by the dreadful loss of this friend that they had so much hope for and that they dearly loved. So whether it's in pastoral counseling, whether it's in whatever your area or expertise, even within the subdivisions of practical theology, there's a powerful model there, it seems to me, of bringing life to faith, bringing faith back to life. And I think religious educators have taken that, I think, seriously, as indeed the clue to how to educate in faith, for faith, of faith, from faith, etc. I think as partners together, we have to improve how we go about doing that as practical theologians as well. Let me give the conversation back to you for a little while. Responses to and improvements upon my proposal, and surely it can be significantly improved upon. And also to the question, there's another question coming. There it is. Okay, I went too far. Implications, decisions that are personal, professional. In other words, if you imagine yourself on the road to Emmaus, what are you coming to see for yourself? What are you coming to recognize from my ramblings, from your own reflections, from your neighbor's conversation. Think about that for a moment. And when you're ready, go back to the neighbor and have a chat for another 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll hear some of the common wisdom from the community. What are you coming to see for yourself? When you go home, you say, well, it was a nice dinner, but did you learn anything? Or did you get reminded of anything? Half a minute and we'll come back together. Let's take some of the comments from the small communities into the whole community, especially things you're recognizing, coming to see for yourself. Feel free to raise feel free to raise questions, of course, but if you have answers, that would be even better, especially your own answers. Thoughts, comments, yourself. Thank you.
We have no answers, but we have questions.
Questions?
Our table was talking about the still very present divorce between religious education and the alternative pedagogies that you've been speaking of, and then theological education and higher education in general. Why is it that there's still such a perpetuation of abundant lecturing and not experimentation with these other pedagogies, especially when it's proven in education theory that there are multiple learning styles in the classroom?
Yes. Now, why do you think yourself that that's not happening? Well, there's old patterns, there's ways, but I think I've seen real progress. And I would say this not to be, it wouldn't be blarney or if I say this, but really I know that many of my colleagues in my theology department, the School of Theology and Ministry, very much teach in a way that attempts to engage people's lives with real issues. Now, we are a School of Theology and Ministry, so it'd be a shame if we didn't, I think. But and there is a bias against that kind of pedagogy, you know, if you're asking people, what do you think, rather than telling them what to think. Is it fluff? Is it not serious? But I think we're moving beyond it. I'd like to think that we are, and making progress. But I do think that, again, my totally biased perspective, but the people who helped me, at least, to begin to imagine other modes of pedagogy were the great educators. Dewey, Freire, Montessori, and some of the history of education as well, the great architects and the philosophers over history. Plato, Aristotle, Augustine. Augustine's Catechizandis Rudibus, the Catechizandis Rudibus, this instruction of Rudibus, of country folk, or his De Magistro, his text on teaching, is just, it was revolutionary then, it was revolutionary now. And by the way, he says in De Catechizandis Rudibus, never, ever try anything new or innovative in the afternoon or evening. Don't do it. It just won't work. Yeah. But so the history is there and the resources are there, and you're right. All of the literature, the better literature now in teaching are talking about collaborative learning and partnership in learning and so on. And though theologians have to get on board, I think, with that. Because the people coming into our classes, I think, are coming out of situations where very often they experience good Deweyan education that engaged their own lives and got them thinking about it and reflecting and making up their own minds and coming to decisions. So to walk into a situation then where pedagogically you're treated as if you're just a bump on a log and told what to think and how to think it, and so you teach people what Rahner said or what Barth said, but that's not our task. Our task really is to go beyond there and to get them to think like Rahner thought, and to learn how to think theologically the way Rahner or Barth or whoever thought. So that takes a pedagogy that's beyond abundant lecturing. But I think we're getting there. We're making progress. Another good question, thought, insight, wisdom, whatever. Any other hands around? Here's one. Yes? Oh, there's one there. Okay, thank you. Court.
No, over there. No, she had hers.
She's asked a question. Go ahead.
Oh.
David.
One of the things that I thought of as kind of a personal implication, I'll have to keep thinking of this. why should I begin with the generative experiences of others? Why should I raise those questions? Here's my initial response. It's because all of that is already touched by God. That is, it's not like, oh, well, here we have the God realm, and here we have the experience realm. Sorry, God has already seen it, touched it, is present in it, and we begin there because this is already God's realm. And as we explore that with someone, we're helping perhaps to articulate what they haven't even articulated.
Yes, helping
to,
them
to know what they perhaps haven't even known, but they somehow know.
Or that they don't explicitly know yet.
Explicitly
they don't have a
know
language,
yet.
They haven't said it, they haven't heard it.
But it's already God's, in a sense.
Fine, I think you're making a great point. Now, there's a whole theological question undergirding what you're saying, David, and that is our own life in the world a source of God's self-disclosure to us? Does God disclose God's self in the ordinary and the everyday of our lives? Is the Spirit moving among us? And if you say yes to that, then you say, hey, well, then we better take it seriously in the process of educating in faith. Not that you reduce then, I mean, if God is revealing God's self in my life, then God has been doing that in the lives of my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. In other words, the Christian people over time, to the Hebrew people long before us, and indeed not just among our people, but among all of God's people, because we're not the only people to whom God reveals God's self. So if you take that seriously, then drawing upon the realidad of people's lives and getting them to stop and to name it and reflect on it and probe it and analyze it. I mean, the whole Ignatian spiritual tradition is very much grounded in the conviction that the Spirit of God is moving in our lives. So pedagogically then, not just in spiritual direction, Margaret, but in a classroom, if you're to take that seriously, then you'll have to give voice, it seems to me, to how people name their own reality and reflect upon it. And not that you'll canonize it either, as if it's automatically of God. No, they can be missing the point entirely. So you'll take that reflection on their own lives as is the beginnings of God's self-disclosure, but then bring it to the revelation that has been unfolding from God's holy word for thousands of years, and from the traditions of Christian faith. And then it seems to me that it's in the dialogue, the dialectic, the correlating. And I would even go beyond somebody like Tracy. It's not just a matter of correlating, it's a matter of integrating life and faith, that it comes to be somewhat of a lived faith for people. But there is a whole theology of revelation there that if you accept it, then it seems to me pedagogically you have no other option but to honor it. There was another hand someplace. There's one there. Then we're going to have a few more thoughts, and then we will wind down.
May I suggest the question that was brought up about why are these new pedagogical methods I've known about all my life, but they're new relative to how we teach sometimes, is that the teacher loses control over the outcome, or at least they experience themselves. I mean, I know that if I wanted to accomplish something in my parish ministry and I allowed people to go into conversations like we just did, dyads, and come back to it, I don't know what is going on there, and therefore sometimes I take the shortcut of doing PowerPoints and things like that. So one of the things that we need to do is get into that process of learning to trust that the Spirit moves in all that way.
Good. Thank you. Fine point. Thank you. Let me just conclude with a couple of closing thoughts. Going back to our doctoral students for a moment, those doing doctorates in religious education, many here tonight from our program at Boston College, and the many colleagues here doing doctorates in practical theology, you'll end up, I think, with a particular emphasis, either in religious education or practical theology. But I also think you end up, even though you might have particular emphases, I would invite you to dual citizenship. I have both. I have dual citizenship myself, and my Irish passport is marvelous when you go into places like Syria or Afghanistan, or into Pakistan, as I did not too long ago, they just look at it and smile, so it can help at times. But there's many dual citizenships in academia. I have a friend who is a very active member of the Society for Christian Ethics, also is a member of AAR, and is also a member of the Catholic Theological Society of America. So there are many communities of discourse to which we will belong, it seems to me. And I will encourage you to belong to both and rather than either or. That you might join the REA, or what we have been calling, and I hope return to call, the Association of Professors of Religious Education, and the Association of Practical Theologians, or the Association of Pastoral Theologians, or indeed, in time, when you get a bit of publishing and get tenure someplace, the International Academy of Practical Theology. So that I think theology is still a more advantageous strategic term or self-designation, I suppose, within academia. And yet, I would be inviting people to, as I said, to a dual citizenship. So join AAR, but join also the Association of Professors and Association of Professors of Religious Education. So you will have multiple citizenships. My last thought, and this was a very, when I was teaching those young people, just to go back to them for a moment, when I was teaching those young people in that high school, I was reading this extraordinary document that came from the Second Vatican Council, Gaudium et Spes, the Constitution of the Church in the Modern World. It's still, to me, my favorite document of the 16 that came from that marvelous council. And there's this extraordinary line in it that says, and one translation, I haven't checked the Latin actually, and I should have, but one translation has that the most serious heresy of our time, or this translation has the most serious errors, one of the most serious errors of our age. Like, what is the most serious error of our age? Now, they were writing in 1965, and you would think that, say, communism, you know, surely the most serious error of the mid-60s, or materialism, or individualism, or any, whatever ism you want to take. We could add others, sexism, racism, homophobia, etc. But what are the most serious errors of our age? Well, Vatican II, I think, made this extraordinary statement. It said the split that Christians maintain, I left out that line because it wouldn't, you can look it up yourself, it couldn't quite fit in my overhead. The split that Christians, the split between the faith, which, this is it, the split between the faith which many Christians profess and their daily lives deserves to be counted among the most serious errors of our age. This split between life and faith is the most serious error of our age. And I think both practical theology and religious ed are needed and should be in partnership to counter that dreadful error. Thank you very much. I've enjoyed being with you. Thank you. Thank you.
We have enjoyed this marvelous feast. We have had a bountiful meal, but you have engaged us not in spoon feeding us, but engaging us in creating the meal that we have all partaken of. And some of the key ingredients was getting us to use our imaginations through the stories you told, engaging us in a pedagogy that honored practical theology itself, helping us to think of our own vocations. What is our stake in religious education? What is our stake in practical theology? And I want to thank you for the image of carrying water on both shoulders. Because I think all of us here are carrying water on both shoulders. We're here because we are educators. We are here because we are practical theologians. We are connected to those fields in one way or another. And yet, you have given us some critical tools to be able to think more clearly about that. We have labored under the weight of that water, but perhaps without knowing it quite as clearly, as articulately as perhaps we can think about it now. So we owe you a great debt of thanks. Thank you very much for coming. I wish you all a good night. And Brian?
Before
last good night. Just two things. One announcement. First of all, Sochi, you want to make that announcement. The next event that's sponsored by the Center for Practical Theology is...
Oh, great. Okay. Well, Thursday, October 21st, the Center for Practical Theology, in partnership with Professor Shelley Rambo and Susan Abraham from Harvard Divinity School, I think, are putting together a feminist practical theology conference or evening. And so people are definitely cordially invited. So that is going to be on Thursday, October 21st in the evening from 5 to 8:30. And we will have 6 presenters, 2 of which are right here in front of me. And Dean Moore will participate as well. And so you'll hear more information just by looking at flyers and looking at the School of Theology Collegium, which is the calendar that's online that you can find on the School of Theology website. So.
Thank you. And if you want more information, you can email cpt@bu.edu, which will go straight to Shannon Sigler. And that's the last thing we want to say is thanks to Shannon Sigler for organizing this whole thing and pulling it off. Thank you, Shannon. Appreciate your help. I know Holly Reed also helped some, and she couldn't be here tonight, but we thank her as well. Now you can say, oh, there's the handout. Handouts, if you want the handouts that are covering this material on your way out, they will be available by the exit. Okay, now you can say good night. I'm sorry.
I wish you all a good night and safe journey home. Blessings.